Hi, I'm Georgina Brown.
And I'm Tom Harper.
Welcome to That Wilbur Smith Show,
a podcast inspired by the life and legacy of the legendary adventure writer Wilbur Smith, and about how a taste of adventure can help you think differently about your life.
This episode is the first of 3 special features, in which Tom and I will be joined by the authors shortlisted for the 2024 Wilbur Smith Adventure Writing Prize. The prize is annual, international, and open to writers of any nationality writing in English, with different awards for published, unpublished, and young writers. Like most writers, Wilbur Smith had a fearsome appetite for reading, of the books by those authors he loved, and for discovering new authors. And so the Wilbur Smith Adventure Writing Prize is about readers as much as it is writers. With each book on the shortlist handpicked by librarians and library staff, every year it provides an adventure for everyone. So whatever your taste, there will be a book on the shortlist for you.
And today, for the first in this series, we're joined by the authors C.E. McGill, Charlie McGill, and Francesca de Tores, who were put together mainly because by the vagaries of scheduling, but actually we couldn't have picked 2 more perfectly matched books to kick off with. Both of them are beautifully written historical novels dealing with women who struggle against the constraints of gender and the patriarchy, making their way in very masculine worlds and finding their own ways of navigating that. And for the inner 5-year-old in me, I'm delighted that one involves pirates and one involves dinosaurs. So this is going to be an awesome episode.
So we'll just tell you a little bit about the authors before we ask them to introduce themselves. Francesca is a novelist, a poet, and an academic. She's the author of 4 previous novels, which have been published in more than 20 languages, but Saltblood is her first historical novel. Francesca grew up in Tasmania and, after a 15-year stint in England, now lives in Melbourne, Australia.
And Charlie was born in Scotland but raised in North Carolina, which in fact I'm already picking up in your accent, Charlie, where they attended North Carolina State University. Their fictions appeared in Fantasy Magazine and Strange Constellations, and they're a 2-time finalist for the Dell Magazine's Award for Undergraduate Excellence in Science Fiction and Fantasy Writing, which frankly sounds as if it could have been invented for you, Charlie. Charlie now lives back in Scotland, and Our Hideous Progeny is their first novel. So welcome both. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, welcome, both of you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
So we'll start by asking you a little bit about your books. Francesca, why don't you kick us off? Can you tell us about Saltblood?
Saltblood is a historical novel that tells the true but only sketchily outlined in the historical sources story of Mary Read, who's one of only 2 documented female pirates of what's known as the Golden Age of piracy. And when I stumbled onto Mary Read's life, I thought, oh, pirate, female, this sounds juicy. And then by the time I was halfway through the Wikipedia article, I discovered that actually the stuff before she even became a pirate was even juicier to my mind. For complicated financial reasons, she was raised as a boy, served as a footman, and then joined the Royal Navy and the Army during the War of Spanish Succession before finally ending up on the pirate crew of Calico Jack Rackham with the only other documented female pirate of the age, Anne Bonny.
I don't know how you could not want to read that book after hearing all of that. And I love also that your starting point there, Francesca, like everyone else in the world now, we go to Wikipedia first.
Any researcher, academic author who tells you they don't use Wikipedia is a liar. I mean, we hopefully don't stop there, but let's be honest, it's the universal jumping off point.
Yeah,
I've definitely written books. Too, yeah.
Started with reading a Wikipedia entry. And Charlie, could you just tell us a little bit about Our Hideous Progeny?
Yeah, so Our Hideous Progeny is a spin-off of Frankenstein about Victor Frankenstein's great niece, who is trying to make a name for herself as a paleontologist in Victorian London. This was actually a really interesting period in paleontology. It was kind of the first time at which there was enough extant paleontological evidence to actually start trying to bring these creatures to life and imagine what they might have actually looked like when they were alive, including things like the Crystal Palace dinosaurs, if you've seen those, and everything like that. So after seeing the Crystal Palace dinosaurs, and also crucially, after discovering some letters that describe a certain Victor Frankenstein's experiments, Mary decides to follow in her great uncle's footsteps and bring some of her and her husband's theories to life in a very literal fashion.
Yeah, it's kind of like Jurassic Park rewritten by Mary Shelley, possibly with some input from her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft.
Yes, that's actually how I pitched it once at a Twitter pitch contest. It was Jurassic Park times Frankenstein.
Yeah, perfect.
I think there's arguably even a Jurassic Park little Easter egg in there, because there's a moment when the monster has been constructed and Mary imagines briefly the idea that she and her husband could run a kind of paleontological island exhibit where people would come. And of course, my mind went straight to Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
Yes, I know. I had a ton of fun with that. I eventually stopped pitching that aspect just because I felt like it gave a little bit of a false impression. I didn't want to give people the impression that there would actually be, I mean, no spoilers, but they don't bring out guns and start shooting the dinosaurs at any point.
There's not a bit where they're being chased by a T-Rex in a carriage and looking in the rearview mirror.
And nobody gets eaten on a toilet in your novel.
No, I'm afraid not.
So what inspired the story behind Hideous Progeny, Charlie?
Yeah, so I was actually at university. I had a very, very weird kind of DIY degree that was called Narratives of Science in Fiction and History, which basically just sort of combined a lot of the things I was really interested in, bit of scientific history, bit of creative writing, and a bit of sort of studying the history of science fiction as a genre. So I was rereading Frankenstein for one of those classes, and at the same time I was taking a class in the history of 19th century science. Particularly, we were looking at paleo art that week. In case you don't know, paleo art is basically just a fancy term for pictures of dinosaurs or sculptures of dinosaurs or just any kind of artistic depiction of dinosaurs. And if you haven't seen any Victorian paleo art or the Crystal Palace dinosaurs, they are amazing. They're fantastic, incredibly inaccurate, obviously by today's standards, but they're just so creative and so brilliant. So I fell in love with that whole genre, and because I was kind of doing those two things at the same time, and I was thinking, this is how they were bringing the past to life. Those two wires sort of crossed inside my brain, and I thought, what if there was some descendant of Frankenstein alive during this period who wanted to try that out themselves?
And Francesca, you'd written a number of novels, I think, but this was your first historical novel. So was that something that you thought, I want to write a historical novel, and you found a subject? Or was it just, as you said, that you stumbled across Mary Read and that was the story you had to tell?
No, writing historical fiction now seems absolutely inevitable. Now that I look back, I'm amazed that I didn't do one earlier. My father's a historian. I had done my PhD on historical literature. I'm a huge reader of historical fiction, but for some reason I've managed to avoid it. I think, to be honest, I had thought it would be too much work. I thought the research sounded like a lot of hard work. The first 3 novels I wrote were dystopian, post-apocalyptic. You could just make stuff up. It was great. But what I discovered was that when you become obsessed with your subject, the research, of course, isn't a chore. It becomes a complete obsession. So I stumbled upon Mary Read, and it wasn't a question of wanting to write a historical novel. It was a question of knowing that my next novel had to be about Mary Read, because everything I discovered about her was more and more extraordinary.
Yeah, it's absolutely extraordinary life, and I say beautifully kind of imagined, given how many gaps you're filling in.
I mean, it's mainly gaps, to be honest.
Which is the best kind of historical novel, when you've just got just enough to be interesting and then your imagination can run riot.
Yeah, it functioned as a very loose sort of scaffolding, which meant that I had a rough shape to the narrative, but I had so much room to play.
Yeah. Can
you tell us, Francesca, how much is fact and how much is fiction?
Absolutely. I mean, a huge amount is known and documented about the period. So we know a lot about piracy, we know a lot about the Caribbean, we know a lot about the War of Spanish Succession, but the names Mary Read and Anne Bonny appear literally 3 times in the historical record, or in 3 documents, one of which is highly dubious. So we're very, very lucky that we have the trial transcript. And I'm not spoiling the novel by revealing that there is a trial, because the twists and turns in these almost unbelievable lives are such that they had one more trick up their sleeve even after the trial. So we have a trial transcript which is pretty detailed and an absolutely fascinating document. We also have a proclamation by the governor of Nassau, which was the island, on the island of New Providence, but the headquarters of the Kingdom of Pirates, as it was then known. And that names both Bonny and Read as women, interestingly, which suggests that they weren't necessarily operating as men during that period of their lives. It names them in a list of pirates who had been involved in the theft of a sloop called the William in August of 1720. After that, there's nothing. We then have a few years after the trial, and after they have dropped out of the historical record entirely, we have this incredibly dicey book called A General History of the Pirates. That's the shorter version of its name, by someone who went by the name, it was not their real name, of Captain Charles Johnson. And this guy just never, ever let the truth get in the way of a good story. So it was pretty ripe in the first edition. It was a huge success. A few years later, subsequent editions came out in which the stories were even more titillating and outrageous. So we do have to take everything that Johnson says with a big pinch of salt, but he gives us far and away the most detailed story, the kind of, what Marvel would call the origin story of both Bonny and Read, which reveals remarkably that both of them in separate countries at separate times for entirely different reasons were, for at least a period of their lives, raised as boys. So I was quite skeptical, understandably, about this, but there is some historical corroboration that makes us think that even the things that Johnson gives us that sound really outlandish, for example, Mary Read serving in the War of Spanish Succession as a man, but there is a historical precedent for that. So we know that there's at least one other really well-documented example of Kit Kavanagh, though she went by many names, who had served not only in that war but in the previous war, and was only discovered after she was badly injured in the Battle of Ramillies, and the surgeon who was piecing her skull together said, by the way, this ain't a man. So even the things that seem, I thought, oh, this is too good to be true, I can't possibly put this in the novel, but time and time again I came up with precedents and things from the context and the milieu that suggested that actually it was entirely possible that Mary had achieved these audacious feats during her life.
This is one of the things from reading Saltblood. I love how you make it plausible. You explain all of those things that we're not sure if she'd be able to get away with. When she's on the remorse, they talk about the hammocks being only 16 inches apart. They are in such close confines, all the men on board the ship. The fact that she manages to hide herself as Mary the woman as opposed to Mark, who she's become, is incredible. So to know that women did this historically,
yeah, I mean, whether we cannot retrospectively apply sort of contemporary, not only terms, but perhaps even contemporary ideas that weren't necessarily available, but it's very clear from Mary's story that her relationship with gender must have been incredibly complex and nuanced. And we only have to look at history and we see that trans and genderqueer people have always been here. They have always, got away with things that weren't considered possible at the time. I use the term got away with, sounds sort of nefarious and loaded there, which is not my intention. It's intended to sound full of admiration at the courage and boldness that these people have always found a way to carve a path for themselves in what was often, and concerningly to me, is increasingly a really hostile world. So whatever Mary's gender identity, it is entirely plausible that she achieved remarkable things, and probably that although we know only little about her, that there were others out there doing similar things.
Yeah. And I love the way in the novel you tie that kind of fluid identity with her love of the sea, and sort of the character is sort of the moment she goes to sea, she knows this is where I belong, and that's kind of what animates her throughout her career. I thought it was a really sort of beautiful way of telling that story.
Well, I think the more I researched the Royal Navy and piracy, the more it became clear how incredibly arduous and dangerous that life was. So there has to be something that keeps her there, despite the risks, the innate risks of that way of life and the added risks of her need for secrecy. So it was a sort of narrative necessity that she loved the sea, because why else would she go back time and time again, be drawn back? And also, of course, I was raised on Lutruwita, Tasmania, an island, and grew up in the sea. So I think that that found its way into the novel.
Right, what you know.
I was about to ask actually, how much research did you have to do on the kind of seafaring aspect?
Well, I wrote the majority of this novel under COVID restrictions. So what I never did was went out on a boat. But I was comforted by discovering that the greatest naval novelist of all time, Patrick O'Brian, also apparently never did so. So I read and I Googled and I printed off giant maps of rigging, and I just tried to make it seem convincing. If you dropped me onto a naval man of war from that period, I would not know what to do. But I hope
you'd know what everything's called.
Sincerely, I'd be able to say some convincing words, and I hope I did enough work to convince the reader that Mary would know what to do. I would be completely at sea, no pun intended. But I was very aware that I had in my head a kind of reader, and this is perhaps an unfair stereotype, who's interested in naval or military history, a sort of middle-aged divorced dad potentially, who would have an encyclopedic knowledge of rigging and would write an angry letter if I got stuff wrong. So I was at pains to do my research.
Yeah. And Charlie, obviously a huge amount of research. You're starting from a fictional point in terms of the sort of the material is Frankenstein. But then that's really just the jumping off point to go into this very vividly realized Victorian world. Which again just felt like you are there, and we haven't got sails and rigging, but we've got scientific equipment, we've got the details of the laboratory, all the different sort of scientific institutions she goes to. That felt like, in order to get that level of realism, that must have been a huge amount of research.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad that it seemed real, because I did have a gigantic stack of books that I was going through. One part of the research that I actually found really, really interesting and just kind of fell in love with was reading like Victorian scientific papers. There are huge amounts, and I can't imagine, Francesca, as well, how hard it must have been sort of a couple of centuries earlier when the sort of paper records are a lot rarer, because thankfully for me in the 1800s so much has been digitized and put on archive.org and everything like that. So I just spent ages reading through the transactions of the Geological Society and the Royal Society. I had a lot of fun specifically researching, I suppose you would call it, the Victorian philosophy of life, where life actually comes from, because I quickly realized that was kind of the main problem and the main hurdle that Mary in my book, there's two Marys here,
Yes.
the main hurdle that Mary Frankenstein and her husband Henry would have to overcome. And so that was just fascinating, reading all the different theories that were present at the time of what actually causes life, and how it might be kind of, artificially created in a being like this. Really jumping off from topics like galvanism, which inspired Mary Shelley in the writing of Frankenstein. But this is now a few decades later that our Hideous Progeny is set. And so those theories have very much evolved and changed. So yeah, it was just really interesting getting to dive into all that science. My advisor was hugely helpful as well. I do not have a PhD in history. I'm not actually officially a historian, but thank goodness, because the first draft of this book was actually written as my final year project. I had my advisor, who was the same professor actually who taught the class in 19th century science, absolute expert in 19th century, Dr. William Kimler. I owe him so much, because basically when he heard that I was starting to do this project, he went, "Oh my goodness, I'm so excited," and provided me with a reading list of about 20 books. I would meet with him every few weeks and he would be like, "Okay, I like the latest draft, however," and then just pull a gigantic encyclopedia of 19th century train lines from his shelf and go, "Okay, there was no train line between Aberdeen and Inverness in 1853.
Yeah.
It's hugely helpful.
Yeah. And one of the things I loved about the science that you work in is, of course, these days it sounds, we know they were kind of going in some wrong directions. So it adds a sort of steampunky kind of vibe to it. But actually, it's not in any way invented. As you say, it's all rooted in actually what they believed in the experiments they were doing. Maybe not to the extent that you portray in the book, but it gives it that slightly otherworldly sort of feel to it.
Yeah, it was fascinating actually, when the book first came out. Well, first of all, just to see all the different sections that people shelved it in bookshops.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I primarily was thinking of it all along as kind of historical science fiction, which I guess isn't generally a genre. But because I was sort of delving so deeply into the idea of what science fiction is as a genre, I like to think of it as, sort of extrapolating from a scientific point of view. And so usually what we think of as science fiction is extrapolating from our modern scientific ideas and extrapolating forward into the future. But obviously we still consider Frankenstein to be science fiction, even though now we know the science doesn't make any sense, because it was extrapolating from that point in time. And so I was really interested in extrapolating from a 1950s point of view of science and imagining, okay, what if all of this actually did work? How how life and the generation of life was theorized to work in the 1850s. And I like that you said that a lot of it seems alien, because that was fascinating to me. I think we tend to think of science often as this like direct progression from A to B. And when you actually look back, obviously at the number of theories and everything that were present at the time, there's such a beautiful wide array of weird scientific philosophy out there that has kind of been lost to time because it ended up being proved wrong, and that's fair, but it's still really fascinating to learn about.
Georgina here. If you're enjoying listening to Charlie and Francesca talk about their adventurous Marys, you can hear more in this series of That Wilbur Smith Show from women who are living lives of adventure today. In episode 25, Tom spoke to polar explorer, scientist, and the first woman to ski across Antarctica alone, Felicity Aston.
Later, in episode 31, we spoke to Phoebe Smith, who began her adventures in the wilds of Snowdonia and today is inspiring a new generation through her We Too Foundation.
And in the fictional realm, we looked at one of Wilbur's most indelible heroines, Sontaine Courtney. Why not take a listen to episode 32 on the Burning Shore today?
I wanted to ask a question about place, because obviously Wilbur's one of the great aspects of his novels is that sense of place and opening people's eyes to new places. But then we spoke to last year's winner of this prize, Emma Stiles, who had lived in Australia at a formative age, but now lives back in the UK. And her novel, No Country for Girls, was in a sense trying to capture that element of those memories of the sort of that formative time in a place she no longer was. And Charlie, I was struck, because actually something we have in common is that we were both born on this side of the Atlantic, but then moved across to America. And I grew up in Connecticut, and you, I think, in North Carolina. And I was wondering whether there's an element of writing about the place you're not. Was that in any way part of the attraction, to this sort of very vividly realized Victorian England and then Scotland that you write about? Was there an element of that, or was it just that, well, that's where Frankenstein would have been, or Frankenstein's descendants would have been?
I think it was a bit of both, because honestly, obviously in Frankenstein, there's the whole section where Victor goes up to Scotland to do the bulk of his labours up there, and so I did really like that parallel. But yeah, I think definitely I probably wouldn't have said so at the time, but in retrospect, I think there was definitely a huge amount of missing Scotland and missing the UK in general. I'd been living in the US for a long time at that point, and I mean, I really enjoyed all the people there. I made so many amazing friends, but it was odd. I never really considered it sort of home. So I think there was definitely an element of homesickness in writing about the Gothic drafty little house on the edge of Inverness, even though I'm not specifically from Inverness, but a great portion of Scotland is cold and Gothic and drafty. So
yeah, the form and the function kind of fit, don't they?
Exactly.
And Francesca, you said that you wrote this book mainly during COVID. So was there, and the book ranges all over the world, and as you said, ends up in the Caribbean. Was there an attraction if you're kind of locked in your house during COVID that to range widely across the oceans of the world?
I think COVID certainly exacerbated it, but to be honest, every book I've ever written has been about islands and oceans. So I think I've just accepted now that that's my lane. The next book I'm working on, ditto. So COVID probably added to that sense of longing. And also at that stage, I've been living somewhat reluctantly in England for coming up to the end of our 15, 16 years there, and was really missing Australia, missing Lutruwita, Tasmania, and I think there was an added appeal to those wide open spaces, the expansiveness and freedom of the ocean in particular.
Yeah, and again, I think when Mary first goes to sea, and I mean, you wrote so beautifully about the sea and the wide openness and the fact there's nothing around you, you can just kind of disappear into it. So you definitely get the impression that she also is channeling that sense of the expanses.
Certainly the opposite of a London flat.
Yes. Yes, and fair to say, Mary's accommodation in England is definitely not where she wants to be.
Yeah. It was strange as well, because I think Mary in my book is also pining for the sea for a lot of the time, because she grew up on the Isle of Wight, and I've actually never been to the Isle of Wight because I was writing most of the book in America, and so I've had people ask me that too. Did you go and do a lot of research around the Isle of Wight and around London? And I was like, no, it was all on Google Maps. I did walk the length and breadth of the Isle of Wight on Google Maps, but
I bet that took a while.
You kind of quickly replica of it in Minecraft or something, couldn't you? And
exactly, yeah.
Charlie, can you tell us? We've spoken a little bit about Francesca's Mary, but in terms of your Mary and the time that she lived, challenging the expectations of their gender, can you tell us how she kind of was breaking down the barriers of Victorian England?
Yeah, so I mean, in addition to just the general scientific atmosphere of the period, I've always been really interested in women in scientific history, and more broadly, just, anyone who's not men. I like how Francesca pointed out that, there's gender nonconforming and trans people have existed all throughout history, and oftentimes it's quite hard to tell because the language is very different. What these people would have identified as today. And so, I'm just always really fascinated by looking at those less studied, less recorded aspects of history. And so as soon as I started writing the book, very soon after, I realized that this descendant of Frankenstein I wanted to write about, I wanted her to be a woman scientist, because there are so many themes around gender in the original Frankenstein, and around gender that I wanted to explore. Also, just because I feel like we don't get to see women as mad scientists very often.
True.
And I thought that would be fun to explore. And so when I was researching this and researching kind of how Mary would fit into this world of science, one of the books that I read was an autobiography of Mary Somerville, who was an incredibly talented mathematician, astronomer. She was named at one point the Queen of Science, unofficially, of the 19th century. So she was hugely respected and admired, which I found really interesting, because obviously your automatic impression is going to be everyone was hugely sexist in the 19th century. So how did this one woman come to such a respected position? And as I was reading about her, and also the sections at the end of her autobiography, which were from her contemporaries, a lot of the information from her contemporaries stressed how, she was such a good wife, such a good mother. She was, really smart for a woman, obviously, but she didn't let that get in the way of also being a wife and a mother. And so that really struck me. And I was kind of realizing all of these, contemporaries stressing how humble and modest and kind and good she was. She was in every other way the ideal Victorian woman. And so that almost gave her a pass in a way to be, abnormal in this one way. She'd kind of ticked all the other boxes. She'd already gotten married and had kids, and, she wasn't neglecting, quote unquote, any of that. And so that really got me thinking about the whole thing about survivorship bias. And if this is what we see in history, what is all the stuff that we do not see? If this is, if in order to make it as a woman in Victorian science, you have to be the smartest, humblest, most amazing woman on earth, then how many other talented scientists do we simply not hear about because they weren't able to navigate that situation, and weren't able to navigate all the stupid stuff, frankly, that people said to Mary Somerville.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was honestly the inspiration for my and Mary's personality. Is I kind of wanted to invert that and say, okay, I want a character who, for one, doesn't have any independent wealth as well. That was something about Mary Somerville, is that even though in the start of her life she didn't have a lot of money, she ended up quite comfortable later on. That is something that's almost mandatory if you're going to study science in the 19th century. And so I wanted a character who didn't have a lot of wealth, didn't have connections, was not seen to be successful as a wife and a mother, and was also just a real firecracker and had a temper that she, couldn't control, and wasn't willing to just sit back and take it, and sort of can't stop herself from speaking out in those kinds of situations. So that just kind of, sprang out, and then I essentially just wound her up and let her go.
Mm-hmm. Like you say, these women have existed throughout history. We just don't hear their stories.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
And I think one of the things that really worked for me in the book was just this mounting sense of rage at the way the kind of male establishment conspires to do her down. And we were talking before we started recording, actually, and Francesca was saying that you a particular character whose comeuppance you badly wanted to see, and I felt exactly the same way.
Yeah, I felt reading Charlie's book, which I came clean before we started recording, I'm 3/4 of the way through, that the galvanism, the bringing to life of the creature, could have been powered almost entirely by pure female rage.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I was channeling a lot into Mary. Yeah, you can't help but be enraged when you read about this period of history, and just even reading Mary Somerville's autobiography. It's clearly, written for a wider audience, and so there are parts where she's taming down her own feelings, but there were parts in there where she would recount how, what her aunts came over and told her that she really needs to stop messing about with all this mathematics stuff and pay more attention to her husband, and all this stuff like this. And you can feel she's being very polite about it, but you can feel that kind of irritation and anger just simmering underneath. And I was angry on her behalf, so yeah, I channeled a lot into Mary, I think.
Yeah, and I say if writing fiction is kind of the transference of emotion, then boy did that come through.
Yeah. I was actually interested, Francesca, because I feel like a lot of times how I create characters is I end up taking kind of little bits of myself and then putting it in a petri dish and feeding that particular aspect and just seeing what grows out of it. I was wondering if you feel like you do a similar thing, or if you have a different process for creating and exploring characters.
I like to think that I'm not drawing on myself, but then I see elements of myself retrospectively and they seem then glaringly obvious, and I feel really narcissistic and solipsistic that somehow this book seems to be about me and my hang-ups again. But actually Mary and Anne were each very different for me because they're sort of at two opposite ends of a spectrum, and I sit perhaps somewhere in the middle. So Mary, because of the nature of her existence, is much, has to be, in order to survive, be much more introverted, less open. I'm a great oversharer, very extroverted. Mary cannot be in order to survive. And Anne is at the far end. Anne is all about desire and appetite, and is enormously unhinged. I mean, one of my favorite bits in the research, and it comes from Charles Johnson, is this brilliant line where he refers to Anne, who was sometimes called the Great Whore of New Providence, because she was known to have, not be terribly bothered by her unsatisfactory marriage and moved on early and often. And he refers to her as not altogether reserved in point of chastity.
How polite.
So a very polite form of slut-shaming. So Anne is this glorious id who just wants what she wants and wants it now, and Mary is at least initially much more reserved. So I wouldn't admit to being either of those, but each of them shares aspects of my personality, and certainly in Mary, that enduring love for the sea is very much me.
Francesca, did you have any other questions that you wanted to ask Charlie?
I have a list of them.
Excellent.
Because I found Our Hideous Progeny such a rich text, even though I'm not yet at the end. I thought there were some really lovely overlaps between our texts. And when, Charlie, you were saying that you'd been interested to see, where it was placed in the bookstores, the book that it reminded me most of was Essie Edugand's wonderful Washington Black, which is a kind of steampunk historical novel. And that book, and both of our books actually, they each share a preoccupation with taxonomies, these systems of classifying. In my book, there's a captain who's obsessed with classifying creatures of the ocean. And obviously in your book, there's all these vicious debates about the different paleontological schools of thought and so on. But ultimately, I think that both of our books are interested in the things that expose the limitations of those imposed systems of classification, the kind of interstices and the in-between spaces. I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about how you thought of that in the development of the book.
That's a fascinating question. Yeah, I think the 19th century in particular was really toxically obsessed with classifying things. It was really the birth of scientific racism at that point, trying to divide humanity into bits and pieces and explain what were thought to be, the natural differences between men and women or between different races scientifically. It was almost like they sort of got a hold of science and then ran too far with it. They were like, okay, all right, now we're going to start classifying everything and seeing rules and patterns where there aren't any, or seeing rules and patterns and ascribing those to something innate and scientific rather than something created by your own culture. And so that was something that was really present all the time while I was writing, that I wanted to be really, really aware of. I tried to delve into as well the fact that this world of 19th century science is not just hugely sexist, but is also hugely racist, hugely colonialist, that the entire institution is at its core really running on empire and founded on those very toxic ideas of these innate differences between different types of people. So Mary has a mentor, Mr. Jamsetji, who is very loosely based on a real man called Ardasir Kursetji, who is the first Indian man to be admitted into the Royal Society. I ended up reading his memoir too, which was super interesting, of him coming over to Britain and studying with people there. And once again, it was a memoir that was written for a more general audience, and so evidently there was only so much kind of discussion of of racism and empire that could be included in there before the general white British public would not want to read about it. But it was really fascinating seeing some of the issues that he faced. And so I tried to include some of that in Our Hideous Progeny as well, to point out similarities and obviously huge differences, but also the commonalities and experience between Mary's experience and Mr. Jamsetji's experience in this world that's just so founded on prejudice and bigotry, and as they both try to find their own place to be happy and do what they love in this world.
I'd actually highlighted that particular passage where Mr. Jamsetji holds forth when they go to the Great Exhibition, and he points out how much of the brilliance and wealth and enterprise on display is in fact entirely derived from the spoils of empire, which which raised another question for me, which is something that I grappled with in writing Saltblood, which was this issue of how we can grapple with these things which we now understand to be tremendous historical wrongs: empire, slavery, racism, and how we can articulate those things, or even just write a novel that can be palatable to a contemporary readership that hopefully has some understanding of how terrible these things were, without sort of ventriloquizing characters to say things that perhaps wouldn't realistically have been on their radar. I did a panel recently with Lauren Groff, and she said that the contemporary novelist of history is always speaking with two throats. That you have your characters, which aren't necessarily well versed in gender theory and feminism and, anti-colonial thinking, but we also have the contemporary reader and contemporary writer. So I was wondering how you navigated that and how you avoided making something I struggled with was, how do we not make our historical characters sound like mouthpieces for contemporary feminism, contemporary anti-colonial thought? And yet, how do we express these really crucial truths about the histories that we're representing?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I absolutely struggle with that as well. I think that's something that is always going to be a very difficult question to tackle, but I think an incredibly worthwhile one. There is nothing that makes me put down a historical book faster than when I pick it up, and it's just the diction or the expression or the philosophies that the characters express just don't seem to fit with a certain historical period, even if it's done well meaningly. It just doesn't click for me, and so that was something that I really struggled with. But I think for me, the angle that I tried to approach it from was really breaking down these ideas to their base emotions. And so from Mary's perspective, she is not seeing the world of science through a lens of modern 21st century feminism. She is approaching it even from childhood from an angle of, this is unfair. This is awful. It's not fair that they get to do this and that I don't. And she knows her mentor, Mr. Jamsetji, from childhood as well, and so is introduced very early to that idea of, this is the smartest, coolest guy I know, and yet he's denied these opportunities simply because of where he comes from, because of the color of his skin. And so I really tried to break those ideas down from Mary's perspective, and then have her develop those ideas throughout her life. Again, just concentrating on the core of those feelings, the core of anger and injustice behind all that.
So if I can jump in, I think from a reader's point of view, it seemed like you both managed those issues of like not editorializing from a 21st century viewpoint just beautifully by just letting the characters tell the story, and actually any kind of sentient reader who reads these stories is not going to come away thinking, hey, this is great, this is the way the world should be. And as I say, you feel those emotions. And when I teach creative writing, one of the things I teach is that nothing gets the reader on side more than a sense of unfairness. If the protagonist is being treated unfairly, there's something within all of us that just universally reacts to that. And I think in both the books, you don't need to say this is wrong, or this is not the way the world should be, because like the way the characters live and suffer and are mistreated just exemplifies that.
I had one other question for Charlie, if time permits.
Yeah, please.
There's a lovely passage where you're talking about the construction of the creature, and you write, there is a precise moment which everyone who has ever drawn or sewn or sculpted a thing will recognize, the moment in which it becomes the thing it was meant to be. And it talks about that key moment when it stops being a messy idea, and there it is. And so I was wondering, now if we're thinking about adventure writing, about that part of the adventure that is the adventure of the writing process, and at which point or points during the writing of Our Hideous Progeny you had that moment of, there it is. That's not the messy, horrible draft or the pure platonic idea of the novel, which is, the novel in its best and most perfect form, and every subsequent manifestation feels like a degradation of that. But where were the moments when you thought, oh, yes, I can see this is actually going to work. I can see this is what I was trying to make.
Oh, I mean, I would say for me, I feel like writing is usually a culmination of a lot of those moments on a very small scale. But then I think there usually is. It's probably the first time when I actually sit back and read that first full draft, even as messy as it is. that is the bigger moment when I sit down and I go, oh my goodness, okay, this is actually a thing. That was something that I was really excited to explore as well. In our Hideous Progeny was that parallel between creative work and making the creature. I feel like that was a theme in Frankenstein that I really loved and wanted to explore more, because I didn't want the creature to be I don't really enjoy metaphors that are too straightforward. I like metaphors to be able to be interpreted in multiple different ways depending on the context. And so I didn't want the creature to just be an analog for Mary's child, because then I just feel like we're getting very gendered. Why does everything when it comes to women have to be a metaphor for children? And so I wanted to also give her the opportunity and space to explore the creature as a metaphor for creation and for creative work or a scientific work, a sort of, I guess, child of the mind. And so, yeah, I definitely drew on a lot of my own feelings in that too.
I'd like to ask a question before we wrap up the episode about adventure as a whole. When you were told that you were longlisted initially, but then shortlisted for the prize this year, did you feel that your novels were adventure stories? Did it sit right with you? Francesca, I'll come to you first.
This is the first novel I've ever written in which I think I could probably say yes. I mean, these things are always a surprise, and you never expect them. But for once, my other novels, well, perhaps the first three, but they were adventurous. But this, I mean, pirates, gender play, romance. This is by far and away the most obviously adventurous novel. The previous novel I wrote was a quiet adult literary novel about dead and dying children in suburbia. This was such a break from that. So it was actually a really pleasant surprise to sort of think of myself as someone who had written an adventure novel and think, oh yeah, maybe that is me.
That's so good to hear. Charlie, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I was really pleasantly surprised. Like I said, I've seen Hideous Progeny placed in so many different sections in bookshops whenever I go in, and it's always so fascinating to me to kind of stop and view the book through that different lens and be like, yeah, could be occult, I suppose. And so, yeah, that was really interesting to me, and it really made me sit back, and I think Francesca, the same thing as you, like that kind of note of pride of like, yeah, okay, it does have some exciting bits, some adventures, and chase across the country. I shan't go into too many spoilers, but yeah, I was really surprised. But after I sat down and thought about it, I was like, yeah, okay, I like that.
I think we find when we walk into a bookshop, there is no adventure section. So you can't categorize all of the books on the shortlist in any particular way. Some are going to be in historical fiction, some are going to be thriller, some are possibly in the realms of science fiction. But at heart, we think all of these books do have an adventure.
I mean, I think if you're writing a pirate novel, it's pretty much guaranteed to be an adventure novel.
It's at heart and everywhere else.
Yes.
And science is the real adventure.
Well, yes, yeah, indeed. There we go. Yeah. Hi, this is Tom. If you'd like to find out more about the Wilbur Smith Adventure Writing Prize, you can follow them on Instagram at Adventure Writing Prize. They share opportunities to get involved, book recommendations, author interviews, and stories of inspiring adventurers. It's a place for readers, writers, and listeners alike. Check it out.
So before we finish, I think we should just ask quickly what both of you are working on next.
Yeah, I am actually working on something quite different. It is I say quite different. It's still set in the 19th century and it's still a Gothic historical novel. But it does have vampires. It's very much building off the whole 19th century Gothic vampire canon of Dracula and Carmilla and everything like that, with a little bit of a modern twist a la Interview with the Vampire, perhaps, in there. So I am really excited. I'm having a lot of fun because I've always loved vampires. But I really love the old school, creepy castle gothic velvet and lace style vampires, and so this is really my love letter to that whole genre.
Can't
Is
wait.
your work plan actually just to work through that famous evening when Mary Shelley and Byron and Dr. Polidori were telling their stories? Because I'm totally there for that. Yeah.
That did occur to me only afterwards. I was like, oh wait, I'm just working my way through all those old.
Yeah, fantastic. I look forward to that. And Francesca?
I am writing a book that I like to refer to as existing in the wider Saltblood cinematic universe, which
Exciting.
the Governor Woodes Rogers, who was sent to sort of lead the suppression of pirates towards the end of Saltblood, he had made his name on a previous circumnavigation of the globe, during which he rescued a ne'er-do-well, slightly drunken and violent Scottish sailor called Alexander Selkirk, who had, through his own bad decisions and temper, been abandoned on a remote island 600 miles off the coast of Chile for 4.5 years, and went on to become the model for Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. And he gets mentioned in Saltblood, and at one point my editor said, we were trying to trim it a bit, and she said, do we need that bit about Selkirk? And I really argued for it to stay in the book. And I do think that that's justified because there are links to Mary's questioning of identity, but I also think that was a glaring clue that the worm was in the wood already. I was starting to obsess. And so Selkirk, I'm only writing, or principally writing, about his time on the island. And I thought it would be an adventure story in the sense of how do you survive. Actually, the research suggests it's quite easy to survive. Living was pretty easy on the island. So it's ended up being more of an internal adventure story about who is a man, who are you when literally everything else is stripped away and you're stuck on an island with nothing but wild goats and cats for 4.5 years.
So honestly, kind of a psychological thriller element there.
Perhaps.
Yeah, look out for the goats. And in fact, Charles Johnson, who wrote the History of the Pirates, there's a theory that he could be a pseudonym for Daniel Defoe. I think. Is that right?
A theory that doesn't entirely hold water. I think there's a much more convincing argument to be made that, it's a compelling theory, and there are certain points in its favour, but it's not entirely credible. I think a more likely theory is that Johnson was in fact the printer who owned that press. But, they're both fascinating characters, and Selkirk kind of ties them together.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, thank you so much for coming on the programme. It's been a joy speaking to you, and a tremendous joy reading your books. I'm hoping we're going to see you in September at the awards ceremony. I know, Francesca, you've got a long way to come. But in the meantime, any listeners, the books are Saltblood by Francesca de Tores and Our Hideous Progeny by C.E. McGill, Charlie McGill. And they are both so well worth reading. So thank you both very much.
Thank you. It's been a joy.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah. We'll be back in the next episode with 2 more of the shortlisted authors. And the joy of this shortlist, actually, is that every time you read a book, you think, oh my God, I guarantee you this one's going to win. And then you read another and think, oh, this one's really good too. So we're going to be back with 2 more fabulous novels on the next episode. But until then, it's goodbye from me, Tom Harper.
And goodbye from me, Georgina Brown.
That Wilbur Smith Show is produced by Christopher Wynne. Music by Dewey DeLay. Executive producer, Niso Smith.